A big thanks to Ghostbed for sponsoring this week's episode. Can't get to sleep. Maybe it's nightmares or maybe it's just an uncomfortable mattress. With Ghostbed, you can finally get the scary good sleep that you deserve. For more than 2 decades, Ghostbed has been making mattresses, pillows, and other sleep products designed for maximum comfort and support. Tired of waking up in a cold sweat? Every Ghostbed mattress features signature cooling materials, including their patented Ghost Ice technology, so you can fall asleep faster and stay asleep longer. Get fast and free shipping with most orders shipping within 24 hours. Plus, you'll get a 101-night sleep trial, with free returns if you're not 100% comfortable on your new mattress. For a limited time, our listeners can get 30% off Ghostbed mattresses plus 2 free pillows. Use promo code MrCreeps at ghostbed.com/creepscast to take advantage of the offer. That's ghostbed.com/creepscast with promo code MrCreeps. You have to admit, Dan said as the drone hovered over our deck and lowered its box full of supplies with surprising care. There's something kind of funny about them. Yup, I said with very little enthusiasm. Normally we can't get corporate to buy us coffee, he said. But now we've got a Congo line of flying Roombas bringing us our food. I feel like royalty, I replied in a flat monotone, barely listening to my own words. Oh, come on, Dan cried. I know this sucks, but it'll be okay. We've got supplies. There's a rig just 10 miles away. We can walk to them if we need to. This isn't the 1800s. We're not going to go mad from lead poisoning in our PJs. We just need to hold out. I don't know if he meant it, but Dan's choice of words had a sobering effect on me as I stood beside him on deck. Hold out. I wonder if he realized how tough the next few months would actually be. I was about to say something when I was distracted by the drone. Quietly, it lifted itself from the deck, wobbled gently in the Arctic wind, and then flew off at a deceptively high speed. It was the last one that corporate would send for at least a month, and before it had even left my sight, I found myself missing the quiet reminder of civilization. It's just a bit of bad luck, I said. First the engines and then Gabe. Yeah, you could say that again, Dan replied. Besides, you know that Gabe would have found this whole situation hilarious. He really left us up the creek and without a paddle. Wherever he is, he's laughing his butt off. I knew at some point that I would have to come to terms with the loss of our chief engineer, but for now I was still cursing his stubbornness. If he had just let one of the other mechanics take care of the engine alert instead of telling them to go back to sleep when he had sorted it, the ship would have never gotten stuck. It wasn't like he had planned on having a heart attack halfway down to the engine, leaving things to go from bad to worse as the ship froze in place. That was just plain unlucky, but it was bad luck that would cost us 4 months of waiting around for spring. Any news of the others? Dan asked. I walked over to the railing and stared down at the jagged shoreline around our hull. Blocks the size of small trucks lay angled haphazardly against it, their sharp edges threatening all kinds of damage. It was going to be a heck of a job of making sure everything down there stayed intact over the next few months. Our ship was big, but the weather was bigger. They're facing a tough fight too, the rig, given the weather, I said, but nothing that they can't handle. From there, it'll either be a chopper or sled dogs, depending on how generous corporate is feeling. Either way, they'll be home for Christmas. Us, on the other hand. There was a moment of silence, the first that we had in days since the evacuation got underway. Now, with the last of the drones gone, and our crew having disappeared over the horizon, there was no ignoring the full weight of our isolation. Any radio contact off them? Dan asked. I'm sure they're fine. It's only been about 6 hours since they had left, I said. But if you're worried, why don't you try and raise them anyway? The weather will make it hard, but not impossible. Dan gave this some thought before agreeing. That can't hurt, he shrugged. That storm is getting serious though. Don't stay out here too long feeling sorry for yourself. He patted me on the back before making for the nearest door. He was right about the storm. The wind out on deck was making short work of my cold weather gear, and already a fine layer of frost had started to form on my lashes and eyebrows. But I decided to stand outside for a few minutes more as I came to terms with the catastrophe that had left me stranded in the Arctic during winter. At the very least, I figured I should get used to being alone. It was a little galling, to be honest, standing out there facing the enormity of the Arctic climate. A tiny man stood on a colossal ship that itself was trapped in the ice like a bug in amber, deafened by the wind. I turned and surveyed our little metal fortress, and found myself wishing that I could have joined the others in the evacuation. But the ship was my responsibility, and there was nowhere else for me to go. I decided that before I went back in, I should grab the last of these supply packages. Carefully, I fumbled across the icy deck, looking for the small yellow crate. I found it half tipped over and buried in a growing pile of snow that threatened to hide it entirely. It was only a small box, just big enough to fit a decent supply of potentially life-saving medication, and I stopped down to pick it up with both hands before noticing that it wasn't alone. Another package was on top of it, no bigger than a ring box. Without thinking, I grabbed it, stuffed it in my pocket, and I hurried back indoors. I didn't feel much better once inside, despite the warmth and the light. There was something awfully lonely about the way the metal corridor beckoned ahead of me in eerie silence. The ship was normally a hive of activity, but now it felt derelict and faintly sinister, and with near hurricane winds just beyond the metal walls, there was the claustrophobic sensation of being trapped in a cavern deep beneath the earth, a constant reminder of the enormous forces pressing down on you, threatening to crush you. I stripped out of my coat and shook it free of melting ice water before reaching into the pocket and removing the tiny package. The drone could only bring a single item, so where did this second one come from? I wondered. Holding it up to the light, I saw that it was a rough-looking thing. A tiny box made of poorly cut wood, wrapped in ragged fabric and tied together with a peculiar waxy string. It came undone easily enough, revealing some old hay and a tiny thumb-sized piece of coal. Oh, that's just the weirdest frickin' thumping. The sound came from behind me, a hard object striking the door that I had been leaning against. I cried out and leapt away, instinctively reaching out to open the door under the assumption that somebody was stuck outside. But something made me hesitate at the last moment. I couldn't say what, just a vague sense that the fist that had hammered against the door was not pleading for help. And who on earth could be out there? Everyone is inside. I turned back and I looked down the corridor. It was uncomfortably dark. What few lights lined the walls were flickering and weak. "Dan," I cried, hoping that he would appear, but nothing responded to my voice. I cranked the door open by an inch, peered into the furious white gloom that lay outside, and I slammed it shut before any more of the cold could get inside. There was nothing out there, obviously. Any noise must have been made by something loose getting thrown around, or perhaps the metal shrinking as the temperatures had dropped. Just the wind, I muttered to myself while thumbing the piece of coal that I had unconsciously put in my pocket. Nothing to be worried. "Mike?" The radio went off on my belt and I dang near jumped out of my skin. For a second, I actually thought of running, although God knows where that would be, before I got the better of my nerves and I calmed myself down. "Dan," I said into the radio, hoping to heck that I didn't sound half as scared as I was. "What's going on?" You haven't been mucking around in the freezer, have you? He asked, and even over the radio, I could tell that he was deeply unsettled. God, no, I said. Until we could get a chopper out to us, that was where poor Gabe's body was being stored. Why? It's Gabe, he said. He's gone. His body, it's just gone. We found him just as night began to fall and the storm had really picked up. I had spent the last few hours searching the lower deck, relying on the tiny disk of light emitted by my torch to sweep each room in the hope of finding Gabe's body. The entire time my imagination was in overdrive, and it conceived 1,000 horrible ways that I might find him. But the worst by far was the idea of opening some dark room deep in the bowels of the ship and glimpsing his upright body standing in the corner, lit starkly by my feeble light. It was a ridiculous idea, an intrusive thought that had lodged in my mind. But just like a splinter, I found it hard to leave alone. My mind kept toying with this idea, unable to skip past the awful image of his pallid face turning to face me in the eerie silent dark. Mike, you're gonna want to see this. Dan's voice blurted from my radio, and I jumped a mile at the intrusion. I had only just pushed open the door to some random cupboard when the sound had came and burst the tension that had gripped me. After a brief second spent catching my breath and trying to smooth any anxiety out of my voice, I replied, "What's going on?" "We found him," he said. "One of the engineers checked out the port that opens directly under the ice. He wanted to take a look at the staging areas that the evacuees had used." "And?" I asked. Just get down here. This is something else." I made it to the port in question a few minutes later. It was situated below deck, close to the very bottom of the ship. It was already open, but standing inside by the doorway were several engineers who looked at me but seemed unable to speak. "What the heck is going on?" I asked when I noticed that one of them had been sick on the ice just outside. "Up there," one of them said while pointing upwards. Just see for yourself." I stumbled out onto the ice, bracing myself for the cold, and I found Dan with his jaw hanging open and his eyes wide, fixed on the hull of the ship somewhere above my head. "Dan, what the heck is?" The words froze in my throat as I turned and saw what had left everybody else so shaken. Gabe's naked body had been flash frozen to the side of the hull, about 30 meters up. His back pressed firmly against the steel until ice had formed, and it kept him there hanging freely. His legs, arms, and head were left to dangle loosely under their own weight, giving him the forlorn look of a disappointed child. And his head was so low that it appeared to be staring right at us. And yet I couldn't see anything of his actual expression. The lights on deck were directly overhead and cast his face in harsh shadows. For a moment I was stunned into silence. Part of me was disgusted, another horrified, and another part of me entirely was quietly thinking about the mechanics of lowering a body over the side and then pressing it against the metal so firmly that it froze so completely that it could be left there under its own weight. In the end, the paralysis faded, and I managed to turn to Dan and say, "We'll have to get him down once the storm passes." It had been a long night, one that I had spent locked in my room with the wardrobe piled up against the door for extra security. Even then, I barely slept, and able to stop myself thinking of Gabe's body that, through some dark twist of fate, lay only a few meters on the other side of my bedroom wall. And when my mind wasn't focused on this, I kept wondering who amongst our crew was capable of such a messed up thing. This lack of sleep left me groggy and disgruntled, as I stood out on deck, pleased to at least see that the storm had cleared for a while, and had the engineers rig me up to go over the side. I'd be riding a cleaning platform the entire time, but I was also to be equipped with a harness that attached both to the winch and the ship's gunwale as a backup. With any luck, if the winch had failed, I would get knocked around a little, but I wouldn't be sent plummeting to my death. When it came time to mount the platform, I did so with an outward confidence born from years of experience, but on the inside, I was like a kid with stage fright. It took everything that I had to not rip the harness off of me and go running back to my room, but I had a job to do, and it was one heck of a job. Going over the side and securing Gabe before the engineers applied torches to the other side of the hull to thaw him off of the metal. But as the guy in charge, it was my job. Still, I couldn't stop myself from jumping a little when the motor had started up, and for a moment it felt like the floor was going to fall out from under my feet. As I descended, I caught Dan's eyes and realized that he was every bit as terrified as I was. Neither of us were that bothered with heights, of course. Sure, something could go wrong, but we spent our lives running an icebreaker between oil rigs in the Arctic. It was dangerous work. No, it was the thought of what waited for me partway down. After a minute or two, I saw a lump against the ship's hull appear below my feet. Gingerly, I guided the platform away from the ship by pushing against the hull, making just enough space to let Gabe's body pass as the platform came level. This meant that I was hands-on with the hull as his body rose up to head height. It felt like something out of a nightmare. Up close, I could now see details that had been invisible the night before. Cracked and frozen skin had turned a ghoulish shade of blue, and his open eyes bulged from these sockets like he was on the verge of popping like a balloon. But worst of all were the swollen, cracked lips that had been forced open by a glistening object the size of a fist. Tepidly, I reached out and took Gabe's head, pushing it upright as gently as I could, but still unable to prevent the frozen meat of his neck from cracking from the effort. It was a red sphere, a little polished orb of glass that had been stuffed into his mouth. It was the size of a large apple and was capped with a brass ring that had twine looped through it. Jesus Christ, it's a Christmas bauble. I cried aloud, speaking only to myself before looking up to see if anybody on deck had heard my outburst. When nobody appeared, I returned my attention to Gabe. Briefly, I tried to remove the bauble, if only to get a better look, but it had been jammed so violently into his mouth that it had dislocated his jaw and split the edges of his lips, revealing bloodless flesh, as blue as the ice that coated his exposed skin. I swore with disgust for a few seconds before I took my radio and considered letting Dan know, but what difference would it make? We could all go over the details later. For now, we had a job to do. Better to just get on with it, I figured. With gloved hands, I secured one of the loops around his shoulder, tightening it as best as I could without pulling on him too hard. God knows that I didn't want to separate him from that metal with his skin still welded to it. But despite being as gentle as I could, I still noticed the faint sound of frozen flesh cracking as I tugged the second strap tight on his right shoulder. "He's secure," I said at last. "Tell them to start heating up the hull."
"Will do,"
Dan replied. This, of course, was another part of the process that I had been dreading. It could take nearly an hour for the engineers to heat the hull up to the point where the ice had started melting. That left me dangling nearly 30 meters off the floor with no one but Gabe for company. To distract me, I tried facing the open Arctic, but that savage landscape filled me with an existential dread that frightened me in a different way. It was a painful reminder of how precarious our situation was. Sure, drones could ferry us supplies, and if the situation became truly dire, we could always flee to one of the rigs on foot. But that was still a 10-mile hike in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. I looked out towards the oil rig anyway, if only whatever minor comfort it might provide. From my position, and with the sky clear, I knew that I should be able to at least glimpse the very top of it. And yet, even when I saw the very tip of its crenulations, I found no relief. I saw no smoke and no lights. That in itself was worrying, but not as worrying as the tiny bundle of color that I glimpsed about 4 miles out from our ship at the very limit of the horizon. I hadn't brought binoculars, so I couldn't say for sure, but I knew that there was only one thing that could left such an unnatural mark on the glistening white expanse that lay beyond me. "Dan," I radioed, "can you get somebody on comms? Now that the storm's clear, we need to reach the rig and make sure the evacuees were received safely."
I already tried,
he said.
Got one of our engineers up there now. Told them to contact me if they had any luck.
Have they?
Nothing yet. Any sign of that ice thawing?
He asked. Some, I said while looking back at Gabe with discomfort. Beads of sweat were slowly forming on the metal around him.
We can try ourselves once you're back up. For now, you've got a heck of a wait ahead of you. Might as well buckle up.
I accepted this logic with a grunt and a grimace before turning back to the Arctic, where my eyes focused on that little patch of man-made color that I knew could only mean something very, very bad. Where the heck are they? Dan fell to his knees and tore into the snowdrift with both hands, slowly revealing a sled laden with supplies. We both had recognized it was from the convoy of evacuees, only it had clearly failed to reach its destination. Standing farther back, I counted the other lumps of snow, many with bits of plastic and metal poking out, and I realized that this abandoned collection of sleds represented almost all the gear the evacuees had taken with them. They must have cut and run, I said. Why would they do that? Dan asked as he stood back up. It's not even that far of a walk, and their pay would be docked for leaving all this stuff behind. The company specified this material was to be evacuated as well. I mean, come on, it's half the reason that they authorized the evacuation. They wanted their most expensive stuff flown to safety too. There's no way those guys would have left it because the walk got a little bit too hard. I mean, they didn't even try to salvage the important bits, or even their own personal items. I had pointed to one sled whose cover had blown over, revealing a pile of rucksacks and suitcases. With a gloved hand, I grabbed a nearby pouch and found an old photo of one of these ship's navigators beside his wife. Dan, standing over my shoulder, observed with a groan of despair. What the heck, man? He cried. This is messed up. Why would they do this? We've got to keep going to the rig and ask them. I mean, we're already halfway there. Crap, why haven't they come back for it? I looked out towards the rig. It was closer now, but still no sign of life. No blinking lights, no distant smoke. Nothing. Damn, I got a bad feeling about all this. We need to head back. No, we need to go ask those idiots. Dan, I don't think they left this stuff behind because of bad judgment. What do you mean? They cut and run, I said. Something made them drop everything and run for their lives. It's the only explanation that makes any sense. And when you think about Gabe's body, I mean, what happened to it? Do you think we got a psychopath on our hands? He asked. I mean, I've been thinking the same, if I'm honest. What with Gabe's body and all the sneaking around, leaving stuff on people's beds? What do you mean? The little lumps of coal, he said. Everybody got one. I figured it was a prank at first, but look, even if there was a lunatic on board, somebody who seemed normal but was secretly waiting for an opportunity to go all Michael Myers on us, an opportunity just like this one where help was too far to come. How the heck does one guy make nearly 100 people crap their pants and run off scared? And how the heck did they do that to Gabe? We need answers. We need to speak to the evacuees. I got a bad feeling. I repeated as I scanned the ice and snow. Maybe tomorrow. I'm not hiking any farther in this, not today. That storm could make a comeback at any time. Should we try and grab some of this stuff? he asked while pointing to the abandoned convoy. Some of the more sensitive equipment, maybe. Tomorrow, I repeated while trying to hide my nerves. Out in the open, I was gripped by the inexplicable sensation of being watched. Let's just get back on that ship. I think it's time to consider a mayday, Dan muttered as we both stood paralyzed with fear at the lower port. Neither of us could truly believe what we were seeing. Gabe's body had been returned to its previous spot, and now it had company. It's everyone, Dan groaned. Every one of them. I count, I can see. I forced my eyes to wander over the naked bodies of my former crew, men that I had seen just hours before, now frozen to the side of my ship like little baubles. Even from this far down, I could see clear signs of the damage. Unlike Gabe, they hadn't been dead long enough for their blood to coagulate. Their wounds had bled freely for at least a few minutes before the cold had sealed them, so that below many of the bodies were burgundy patches of ice as large as cars. Strange triangular stains that pointed to the grueling acts of cruelty that ended them. A snipped foot there, a missing arm there, a face caved in so badly that it looked like a half-eaten boiled egg. These bodies had been beat up, and even now some of their wounds still dripped onto the ice below. It's not all of them, I said after a few minutes of inspecting the damage. There's only 7. Someone must still be left on board. The canteen was a mess. Tables were overturned and dragged to the far wall, and red smeared the walls in strange, almost hypnotic patterns. Looking at it, I couldn't quite escape the notion that somebody had decorated the room with bits of people. What looked like intestines trimmed the windows and draped every flat surface, and shriveled bits of black and pink meat hung from light fixtures with old brass hooks. On one of the doors lay a wreath made of something that I couldn't entirely recognize, but which I felt no compulsion to investigate further. All I knew for sure was that there were enough fingers bound in its strange material to account for nearly a dozen people. And in the center of the room lay 3 boxes, plain packaged, wrapped in brownish paper and tied with a familiar waxy string. But unlike the packages with coal, these were far larger and they also had tags. Dan stood in the doorway, audibly gibbering as I approached the nearest box and inspected the little note. The letters seemed Germanic, and the handwriting oddly ancient in its styling. I had no hope of translating it, but I did at least have the sense to take a picture with my phone, as a reference so I could recreate it here. What the heck does that mean? I muttered before pulling at the twine. The note made no sense, but it was clear this present, it had been left for us to find. This is leather or something like it, Dan said as he stood by my side and ran a palm over the paper the box had come wrapped in. Ah, Jesus, he cried suddenly, jumping backwards, as if it had given him an electric shock. What is it? I asked. He jabbed nervously at the square foot of fabric that he had dropped on the floor. It's got a tattoo, he groaned. I looked down and sure enough, the waxy beige paper had a faded, blue-ink tattoo of what looked like an anchor. Someone's messing with us big time, Dan cried as he shuffled over to the door. It looked like he wanted to flee, but when he realized that I wasn't following, he couldn't bring himself to go running off alone. Instead, he waited nervously as I finished unwrapping the box. When I finally opened it, I felt an icy terror run down my back, like a trickle of cold water. What is it? He asked from the door. It's a bauble, I said, like the one that we found with Gabe, only much bigger. I lifted it up gingerly, gripping the thread with a gloved finger and thumb. This one was glass, much like the other, but 3 times the size. And its contents were not an opaque red. They were ivory with glimmers of pink and crimson, teeth. Hundreds of them. I uncapped the top and turning it upside down. I watched as they poured out like little pebbles onto the floor. Many of the roots still had bits of gum attached, and a few were shattered from the force of being removed. But what really terrified me was the sheer quantity. They couldn't have come from the men who had remained on the ship. There were too many. At a guess, it looked like 20, maybe 30 people's worth of teeth, slowly piling up on the floor. Dan, I think it's time to send out a mayday and get the heck out of here. Well, they found the radio, Dan said, his voice a flat monotone as we surveyed the damage to the helm, not to mention what was left of Alec. Is that a Christmas tree? I muttered, only just able to glimpse Dan's nodding head as he confirmed my suspicions. What remained of Alec had been destroyed beyond almost all recognition, barring his surprisingly intact head and the expression of agony painted across it. Otherwise, his body had been stripped and repurposed into a conical shape. His spine, fused with other bones, ran straight to the ground, and his skin had been removed and replaced into a strange new arrangement, such that it had bunched around his neck and spread outwards in a cone where it had reached the floor, and it was nailed down with black wooden pegs. It strongly resembled a wigwam, complete with a slit down the middle that revealed the contents within. They made him into a tree, I muttered again, surveying the gut-wrenching arrangement of his ribs and limbs made to resemble stunted branches that helped prop up the tent. What do you make of that? Dan asked while gesturing to the large glass pane that made up the helm's view of the ship beyond. Normally, it would be clear, but right now it was covered in what looked like thousands of tiny handprints made of blood, and what might have been even crap. You might imagine the handprint of a child, by the way, but this was not the case. As small as these were, these hands had the slender proportions of an adult, just somehow shrunk down. The effect was bizarrely unsettling, the kind of thing that simply didn't look right. And yet, as horrifying as this sight was, it was the smashed and broken radio that truly threatened to send me spiraling into despair. Nothing remained. Even worse, all other spares on the ship had been gathered up, brought to this location, and pulverized into barely recognizable bits and pieces. I recognized the radio from my own office, and Dan's and even Gabe's. I would say that's every last radio on this ship, I said. Look, Dan said, gesturing to the two boxes at Alec's feet, or foot rather, as he now balanced on a single, vertiginous limb. I had to imagine those boxes were the unopened presents that we had left behind at the canteen. Shall we open them? Screw that, I replied. Let's get the heck out of here. You know, the more that I think of it, the more messed up the whole concept is, Dan said as we approached the abandoned convoy. What concept? Just the elves in the workshop, he replied. Elves, I scoffed. A little handprint? He replied while waving his own palm at me. And yeah, lumps of coal decorations. Freaking elves, man. It sounds stupid, but can you imagine being the first guy to describe a gorilla to someone? It's a weird world. Plenty of weird stuff in it. Why not elves? So what? I asked as we continued trudging through the snow. We were naughty. No, I think it's different, he said. I mean, like I said, right, it's a messed up idea, isn't it? All those toys being made by elves, I mean, why? Who pays them? It can't be their natural environment. Pays them? I cried, and for a moment I couldn't help but laugh. Yeah, who pays them? He snapped. Like what? They do it for the fun of it. I mean, come on, we've heard that one before, right? Forced labor, but don't worry, they actually like it. They like making free stuff for us to enjoy. I just assumed it was a story, I said. I think we got bits and pieces of something lost to history, he replied. But whatever the real deal is, These things are upset and mean. I get the feeling that we're paying for sins that were made centuries ago. Feels like they hate us, doesn't it? I'm just saying, if you think about the stories that we've got, stories that were passed down, it makes sense why they feel that way. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not going to say there hasn't been something of a theme to what we've seen, I said. But let's hold off before we start throwing words like elf around. Before I could finish my sentence, something caught my foot, and I went headfirst so hard that I practically disappeared into the snow. Thankfully, even as I fought against the suffocating weight that had enveloped me, Dan ran over and was digging me out before panic could really set in. That helped me get my bearings, and as I used both hands to push myself up, I realized at last what had tripped me. "Oh crap," I hissed. "It's..." For a moment my mind stalled as I tried to think of another way to describe what was laying at my feet. "There are presents," I finally said. Dan knelt down beside me and surveyed the 2 brown boxes. "I think we need to take the hint," I said. "I'm 99% sure these are the same ones in the canteen and the helm. The tags look identical." "Should we open them?" Dan asked. "I don't know," I said. "It's getting cold." Out of nowhere, a snowball pelted me in the face. It hurt like crazy, and I cried out before swearing violently. Ice had gotten right in my eye and something sharp had lashed my face. Looking down, I saw the remnants of the snowball, and I noticed glass shards glistening in its crumpled remains. Another one flew past and narrowly missed Dan's face. Looking around, neither of us could spot where they were coming from, but the snowdrifts were deep and only growing as the blizzard worked up to full strength. "Just take them with us," I cried, "and let's get to that rig." The elevator didn't respond to our call, so we were forced to climb the stairs, and it was no easy feat. It wasn't just that we were exhausted. It was the sheer weight of despair brought on by the realization that the oil rig was so clearly unpowered. Your average rig houses thousands of people, and it will often come close to being the largest man-made object that you'll ever see. But this one was silent like a haunted house. And the further that we went up the stairs, the more certain I became that we would find no one alive. Our evacuees never made it, and the men who awaited them had likely suffered the exact same fate. "Here we go," Dan said as we at last had reached the door. "That's not a good sign," he added as we both observed that it had been left open and snow had already begun to gather on the other side. We squeezed past anyway and surveyed the small room beyond. It was filled with coats and boots and other cold weather gear reserved for the workers who had the misfortune of having to go down the ice for whatever work it needed doing down there. All of it looked untouched, half frozen in the cold and slowly icing over. That door must have been left open for a long time. Beyond that, we found our first signs of a massacre. Streaks of red along the floor and walls, a lone shoe with a foot still inside, a scalp nailed to a door. The further we went, the more we saw of the crew and the damage done to the remains. Some of the rooms had been barricaded, we had noticed, and while most of the barricades had come tumbling down and their occupants dragged out, kicking and screaming from the looks of the bloody finger marks, only to end up destroyed by God knows where in the depths of the rig. Other barricades remained steadfast and intact. At these doors, Dan and I would stop and knock furiously, in the hope that at least a few people had survived and holed up in their rooms, but nobody ever replied. On the few occasions that these rooms had windows, we looked inside and only saw empty rooms filled with tins of food that no one ever got to eat. Clearly people had tried to plan for the long term, but what happened to them no one could say. "At least it's silent," Dan said as we had ventured deeper inside. "No footsteps." "Man, the heat is on," I added. Dan stopped and sniffed the air, his grimace showing that he clearly understood what I meant. The stench in the air spoke volumes about how many corpses must lay nearby. Maybe who's ever hunting us abandoned this place, Dan said, but before I could reply, his words were proven drastically wrong. From deep within those haunting corridors came a keening wail that slowly drifted into what I could only describe as a sort of singing. The tune was alien to me, bordering on pure noise instead of music, but there was no denying that an underlying pattern invoked in me fear and unrest. It was music made for inhuman ears and maybe even inhuman minds. I was close to peeing myself when I realized that it was rapidly approaching our position. "Where's the radio room?" I asked Dan, who had experience of this particular rig in the past. "Crap," he hissed as he scanned the different hallways. "I think it's this way." Together, we took off down the hall that he singled out, and on more than one occasion we were sent nearly skidding to the floor as we ran across a slick layer of half-congealed blood, amongst other things. By the time that we had finally made it to the radio room, our clothes and hands were soaked in a foul-smelling liquid that looked nearly black in the low light. Although I noticed with a hint of humor that neither of us had dropped our presents. "All right," Dan cried as we barged into the room, and he ran over ready to fiddle with the machinery. I slammed the door shut and locked it and turned around to see what might be the single greatest thing that I had ever laid eyes on. The radio was intact, and it was even blinking with lights. And to reinforce the good news, Dan began to cackle with hysterical joy. "Oh crap, they did it," he squealed. "They got an SOS out. It's been ringing for 2 days. Oh crap, Mike, they're on their way, man. They must be." I slid against the door and began to laugh and cry with relief. I had spent so long expecting the worst-case scenario that this little bit of good news felt like it was at risk of making my heart explode. "Oh, thank God for that," I cried. "We can hole up in here and—" The singing returned, a distant howl that quickly ramped up. Before either of us had a chance to speak, it became a deafening cry and the door behind my back began to vibrate with the chorus of 1,000 alien voices. Dan looked at me with utter despair. "We're not going to make it," he said. "So close, maybe a day at most, but those things will never let us go. We should just open these presents and then sit back and wait." An idea struck me. I looked down at the box in my hand and realized that it might be our only hope. "Are you sure about this?" Dan whispered as he stood by the door. Much to our surprise, the singing had cut off suddenly, but the rapid pitter-patter of little feet just beyond told us that we were not alone, not yet. "You said it yourself," I said. "They hate us. Let's give them a reason not to." Together we opened the boxes that we had carried so far and emptied them, and stuffed whatever objects that we could find on hand. Shiny things, electronics, a radio handset, a phone, a watch. We piled as much as we could into the empty boxes, before wrapping them and tying the twine into delicate bows. "A gift exchange," Dan snorted as he gripped the door handle. "I'm gonna die over a gift exchange." "I just do it," I said. On the count of 3, open the door and push the boxes outside. "All right." He nodded and we both counted down in unison. 1, 2, 3. Dan ripped the door open and shoved the boxes outside, but before he could even extend his arm all the way, he was pulled so hard that his face had slammed into the steel. For the briefest of moments, he looked at me with terror in his eyes. I overcame my terror and began to run towards them, but it was already too late. A grotesque but tiny fist reached out, hooked a claw finger into his mouth, and it was soon joined by nearly 100 others that all gripped Dan's body and clothes wherever they could find purchase. The last thing that Dan said was a muffled bunch of words that I never managed to understand. And then with a single effort, our hunters dragged him beyond the threshold, and I reached the door in time to slam it shut and lock it tight once more. Help came in the end. I couldn't say how long I was in that room. It felt like weeks, but in truth it was probably no more than a day. But still, it dang near drove me insane. Not just the waiting, but the sounds of claws scratching at metal and strange symbols daubed on the glass outside. I slept whenever exhaustion took over my body, and each time I would awake to find new decorations inside my room. Whatever those things were, it was clear that they could have killed me any time they wanted. I had to assume that my plan had worked, but all the same it was a poor consolation given the loss of my closest friend. Too little too late. When help finally arrived, it came in the form of some very stern-looking men in black military uniform, devoid of any signifying markers. Given the way they set about planting explosives while two of them manhandled me towards a chopper, I assumed they were going to fly me to some dingy little room and interrogate me. But they didn't. They dropped me on a civilian ship and left me to receive medical attention from some very confused-looking researchers. Of course, when I tried to tell them what I had seen and heard, it quickly became clear why my rescuers didn't think it was necessary to beat or threaten me into silence. No one believed me. I mean, why would they? My story was the rambling of a lunatic. The ship was sunk and I was blamed for sailing it right into an ice shelf, which technically wasn't incorrect. And the oil rig was lost to a nasty fire. At least that's what official reports had said. I never really moved on though, and even now this time of year threatens to overload my senses. It isn't just the constant reminder of the messed up things that I saw. It's the cards they keep sending me. Each one written in what I've since discovered was Anglo-Saxon, or Old English. They thank me for my gift. Not the box, you understand, but Dan. They thought that Dan was the gift. They took him gladly and spared me. I might find it possible to move past this, to live with the guilt even, if they weren't so insistent on including bits of him in the card. A finger, an ear, a tooth, his tongue. Fresh meat pinned to the raw-looking paper made from God knows what, and their notes scrawled in that bizarre Germanic tongue keep thanking me over and over. Thank you, good friend. They write me in the words that chill me to my core. Because it doesn't take a doctor to tell that even though it's been over a year since I last saw Dan, the bits of him they post have been freshly cut and taken from a man who must surely be alive.